Our speaker today is Catherine Marshall, art historian, curator and writer. Catherine has presented for us before as well, and she's going to talk today about depictions, both contemporary and current to the War of Independence, and how it was depicted in art at the time.
Hello, my name is Catherine Marshall. I'm an art historian and a curator, and I've been asked by Julia Walsh in the Clonmel Museum to talk to you today about Irish art and the War of Independence. I'm going to widen that a little bit and talk about Irish art and the wider struggle for independence, because the time frame offered by the War of Independence itself, which is officially January 1919 to the middle of 1921, is so short that obviously the artworks spill out before and after. Okay. So I'm starting with a portrait of Sean Keating a portrait of Dan Breen by the very well-known Irish artist and contemporary of Dan Breen's, Sean Keating. It wasn't painted until 1958, so strictly speaking, it's not an artwork from the War of Independence. Indeed, there is very little in the way of artwork directly from the War of Independence, but it is a very fine portrait of the man who kicked off the War of Independence with his ambush with 7 other people at Solohead Beg in Tipperary in January of 1920. And he's painted by a man who himself was also active in the IRB and a Republican sympathiser, and who had painted and did paint, and I'll be showing you some more of them, a number of other paintings relating to the struggle for independence generally. The two men, though, took quite different ideological positions, apart from the one thing that bound them together, which was their belief in an Irish independent republic. And they were that Dan Breen, who was, a really important leader and very famous figure from the Civil War, from the War of Independence, went on to be a politician in the Free State. Came in fact, was the first Fianna Fáil politician to take a seat in 1927 after Fianna Fáil agreed to enter the Dáil, and then became a TD for Tipperary for many years until his death in 1965, or just before his death in 1965. But he also was quite outspokenly sympathetic to the fascist cause in Europe, and sent, messages of sympathy to Hitler, or support messages to Hitler from time to time, and had great faith in both Franco's regime in Spain and Mussolini's in Italy. And of course, they are areas of political ideology and political activity that Sean Keating was absolutely opposed to. All his life, he was disillusioned with the Free State that he had helped to bring into being, because it was such an unequal society, and because he felt it let down the ideals of republicanism that he and colleagues had sympathised and advocated so much from 1916 onwards. So in fact, Keating was a socialist and a communist, and yet when the two men met in 1958 to paint this portrait, they got on very well. So I think we have to look at this portrait as maybe an example of a bit of a softening that people sometimes acquire with age, and a lessening of the harder judgments that they made in their earlier years. In any case, I would strongly argue that this is a very sympathetic portrait of Keating. And it's marred, or not marred, it's a strongly sympathetic portrait of Dan Breen, I should say. If it has any limitations, they are the limitations that Keating himself acknowledged, that his hands were getting quite arthritic and it was becoming increasingly difficult for him to paint. So he had great trouble, for instance, painting the embossed patterning of the wallpaper behind Dan Breen's head. But that's incidental, really. and takes nothing away from the warmth of this portrait. And of course, Dan Breen has lost none of his sharpness, that kind of, direct gaze that he throws out towards the artist and ultimately to us is just as penetrating as it ever would have been in the earlier years of his political activism. Okay, well, I said that I couldn't confine what I was going to say to the period 1919 to 21. In fact, it's even difficult to talk about Irish art in a wider context relating to the struggle for independence, because the arts in general in Ireland were so neglected in the first 50 years of the 20th century that the recording of Irish history through the visual arts was pretty neglected, and certainly very neglected if we compare the visual arts to, say, theatre or to literature. And what I'm really thinking about in relation to the visual arts was summed up very well by Dr. Tom Bodkin, who had been director of the National Gallery of Ireland in the early years of the 20th century. In 1949, he was commissioned to write a report on the state of the arts in Ireland, which was published in 1949 by the Government Stationery Office and again by the new Arts Council when it was formally established in 1951. So Bodkin said, and I quote, "No civilized nation of modern times has neglected art to the extent that we have during the past 50 years. And of course, Bodkin went on then and as he did all his life, to advocate for better opportunities for artists, and the Arts Council from 1950 onwards became the vehicle to progress that. But the period leading up to that is the one that we're mainly concerned with. So I want to look at some of the art that was made around the period from the 1916 Rising up to and beyond, indeed up to the present day, that relates to the struggle for independence. Here's a work by a very famous Irish painter, maybe the most, indeed, the most significant academic painter in Ireland, or even in Britain, one of the most important for the first half of the 20th century. His name was William Orpen, and this painting, The Holy Well, he painted in 1916 when he was home on leave from the work he was currently doing as a war artist in the trenches in World War I. Now, Orpen was very interesting in relation to his job as a war artist. Instead of painting the generals at the base, he tended to, spend his time out in the trenches with the Tommies and record the devastating experience that they had. But here he is, home on leave in Ireland. And he did a series of paintings during that time in a style that we don't normally associate with him. So this is quite unusual for him. It's a very large painting, and it throws a fairly sceptical and somewhat cynical eye at religious practices in Ireland around 1916, and we know that some of those practices continued. So it's a pattern, and sometimes called the orphans at the Holy Well. And what we see are a group of peasants queuing up to take the waters of a well. Now, the fact that they're naked, I think is not a pattern that was commonly practiced in Ireland in 1916 or at any point. Indeed, I think the Catholic Church would have taken a very, very, very dim view of that. But Orpen has given himself a little bit of poetic license here in the interests of introducing the nude into Irish art. It wasn't a subject very often treated, but also in this case he makes it look as if the people have been shamed by having to take their clothes off and submit to this ritual. The ritual is overseen by a priest standing on the extreme left-hand side of the painting, dressed in what looks to me like the habit of the Dominican order. But the priest is distracted from supervising the taking of the water by a figure standing on top of the well. And that figure is really interesting in our discussion because it is modelled on one of Orpen's favourite pupils. It's actually modelled on the artist Sean Keating, whose work we saw already in the portrait of Dan Breen. And if you look at the stance of Sean Keating up on top of that rocky mound there. He's standing, gazing out beyond the scene, not remotely interested in the religious ritual that's taking place underneath him, definitely not part of it, and symbolising a much greater freedom. He was, of course, an artist. He's a nationalist, and that is suggested here by the fact that he's wearing very traditional West of Ireland, indeed Aran Island clothing, you know, the woolen woven shirt and that kind of sleeveless outfit he has over the shirt, and he's got his finger stuck into a kris, which is still woven on the Aran Islands to this day. And he looks completely independent of it all, as I've said already. But not only was he an artist and a nationalist, he also, of course, was already himself a Republican sympathiser. So he symbolises the new Ireland in this painting. And Orpen is pointing to the future in the pose and the direct gaze of that man standing on the rock, and the distraction that he poses to some of the figures down in the collection underneath, or in the group of peasants underneath. So you see a figure on the extreme right, a man wearing a hat. He too is looking away from the religious ritual up to the man on the mound, as is the priest, as I've already mentioned. So in a way, the three of those figures represent the kernel of the tensions that were to become important in the new Ireland. But what of the war, the struggle for independence? The painting you're looking at now, The Arrest of Countess Markievicz, was painted in 1916 by a young woman artist, Kathleen Fox. Kathleen Fox was a student at the Dublin Metropolitan School of Art, where she would have known Countess Markievicz, who herself was an artist and who visited the schools quite frequently. Kathleen Fox also came from a fairly privileged Dublin middle-class background, and in the week following the rising, she decided that she would take a stroll into Stephen's Green and check out what this rising that was hitting the newspapers was all about. So she arrived in Stephen's Green in time to witness the arrest of Countess Markievicz, and was quite shocked that somebody she knew was playing such a leading role and was being arrested by the police for it. It is believed that Kathleen Fox was herself, that she represented herself in this painting. In the figure, I don't know if you can see the arrow that I'm using to outline the figure to the right here, looking out towards us and wearing a straw hat. That is a common trope in the history of art for the artist to connect with the audience in this way and to suggest, sorry, I was outlining the wrong figure. It's this little smaller figure here, slightly more distant again, and wearing a straw sun hat. That's Kathleen Fox. She is calling attention to the fact that she was actually a witness of this event that she paints for us. But what's really interesting for our discussion is what happens next. She obviously didn't paint this on the spot. She went home and immediately, though, painted the picture. But then she hid it under her bed for a couple of years. She was afraid to show it. She never got it framed. She had it smuggled out of the country and sent to the United States. And she did this because she was afraid that somehow, having painted that picture, she was revealing a sympathy for the cause that might actually get her into serious trouble with the authorities. The painting stayed in America until 1945, when, for the first time that we know of, there was an exhibition in the National College of Art of Irish painting representing Irish history. And so at that point, Kathleen Fox felt it was safe to resurrect her painting, and she brought it back to Ireland for the exhibition. Now, that's 23 years after the Free State was already established and, you know, effectively the norm in Ireland, and yet it took her all of that time to feel that she could bring this painting out into the light of day. So, what's the message? The message is that if you were making art openly sympathetic to the Irish cause in 1916 or in the years immediately after, it certainly might not feel too safe to show it. And here's another painting that was begun in 1916 but not finished until around 1929. We don't know exactly when John Lavery finished this painting. It's called High Treason, the Court of Criminal Appeal, the Trial of Roger Casement. So Roger Casement was arrested and charged and convicted of treason at the time of the Easter Rising in 1916. He appealed against that conviction, and so this is his appeal hearing in August of 1916, the same year. The appeal court lasted a day and a half, after which the conviction was upheld and Casement was taken into a prison yard and hanged and buried in Pentonville prison. So that's the story behind this painting, or at least it's one of the many stories behind this painting. But Sir John Lavery, the artist who painted it, was, again, like Orpen, a very well-known and highly regarded portrait painter in the period around the first 3 decades of the 20th century. He had a very successful practice, not just in Ireland, but in all over Britain and Europe and in the United States. He went out to Hollywood to paint portraits to commission out there. So he had a hugely successful practice, and he was associated with high society in all of the countries that he travelled in. It's thought that he may have been asked or had this portrait suggested to him by the Chief Justice at the bench on the left, the man in the centre of the red robes on the left, who was Chief Justice Lord Darling. Darling had previously, in fact, commissioned or been part of a bigger group commission to Lavery for a painting, and he came back to him to record this because obviously he saw it as a significant moment in his own personal history and in the history of English political life or British political life. There's no formal document to show that he commissioned Lavery, but he went on in the aftermath of Casement's death to help Lavery to progress the portrait. He arranged for him to have access to this room in the court so that he could get the atmosphere and the details of the room right. He arranged for some of his colleagues and some of the clerks of the court sitting beneath him on the left-hand side of the painting to pose for Lavery, and it was up to Lavery himself then to gather together the people who were acting for Casement, who are the group largely represented on the right-hand side of the painting. Sorry, did I say represent Lavery? Represent Casement. And then we come to the prisoner himself. There he is in the dock, one of the smallest figures represented in the court, directly in the centre of the painting and directly opposite the artist as he was painting it, because although it's obviously not revealed in this version of it, Lavery and accompanied by his wife Hazel were sitting in what would be the jury box in a normal court, directly across from where the prisoner is in the dock. I've maybe called this a painting when Lavery was doing, but of course he only did drawings for it while the court was proceeding. He went away and completed the painting in his studio over the next 13 years, as you see there. So what have we got? We've got a painting that created a lot of controversy in the English papers. Lavery was accused of letting himself down, of venturing outside of what he was known to be good at and admired for, which is, of course, elaborate portraits of people in high society. Just to give an example of how highly regarded he was in high society, I'm showing you the portrait that he did of the royal family in Buckingham Palace in 1913. It's said of this that he and the king got on so well that he allowed the king to paint part of the sash on the king's uniform, and certainly the royal family facilitated giving him a room in the palace that he could use as a studio, and they all got on famously, we believe. Well, if Lavery was departing from his usual clientele in painting Casement's portrait, we need to know, or Casement's trial, we need to know a little bit more about why. Lavery, it turns out, of course, he was of Irish and Scottish descent. His parents were from Belfast. He grew up in Scotland, came back to live in Ireland for a good part of his life, and had this busy practice that I've already mentioned internationally. But he had sympathies that extended right across the political spectrum, from Unionists in Northern Ireland to Republican freedom fighters in the South, and moved in all levels of the societies that came together during the struggle for independence in Ireland. So let's have a look at what kind of messages he's sending out in the painting of the appeal trial of Roger Casement. The first one is that Casement himself is framed in the dock, right in the centre of the picture, stripped of his own clothing and wearing felon's garb, in contrast to the very richly and colourfully dressed judges on the bench, who seem to be quite sort of pompous and self-important compared to the humility of the presentation of the prisoner in the dock. However, Casement was very aware of the artist sitting opposite him and of his wife, and he wrote to his cousin saying that he felt great sadness coming from the woman sitting with Lavery, and he was quite intrigued by what they were doing. And indeed, Casement's cousin, Gertrude Bannister, who is one of the figures in the seated, I think I can find her for you, here she is, in the group on the right, who are, if you like, Casement's team. She wrote to Casement just before he died, saying that she too felt that the Laverys were very sympathetic to his cause. In any case, if we then look at the evidence that the painter himself offers, what we see is a curiously incoherent perspective in this painting, and that's odd coming from an artist as accomplished as Lavery was. So I'm showing you a painting where the perspective used correctly is very clearly focused to direct our eyes straight to the principal character in the painting. And I'm going to again resort to the mouse and suggest, if you follow all of these perspective lines, they all centre on not just the figure but the face of Jesus Christ at the centre of this painting. If you extend all of these lines from whichever side of the pictorial space you're in, they all converge on that point. And that would have been, standard, classical, academically trained, a trained method of representing physical space in a painting, and also used by people, by distinguished artists, for the emotional effect of focusing on key figures in the painting. Well, in Lavery's painting, if you follow those perspective lines, you get a very different picture. The only one that this particular version of the painting, with all of these lines superimposed by me just to follow those directions and see where they lead, is the only one that hasn't been outlined here, is the broken line of the shadow from the balcony up here at the top right, that leads natural daylight into the court, and that is the only one that focuses directly onto the prisoner in the dock. Instead, though, the other lines are used to create quite separate and distinctive spaces in the court that seem to separate for the group of judges on the bench on the left from the group of clerks down here in the middle ground on the left, from all of the sympathisers with Casement who are all included with him in the group on the right. Okay, what happened to this painting? Well, we don't know exactly when Lavery finished it, but we do know that in 1930 he offered it to the National Portrait Gallery in London. but a lot had happened in Irish art since then, in British-Irish relations in between 1920, 1922 and 1930. So the National Portrait Gallery in London rejected the offer on the grounds that it was no longer relevant, if it ever had been relevant, but definitely no longer relevant then. So we move on a couple of years. Lavery died in 1941, and at his death he left the painting to the Crown Court's service in Britain, and it was accepted by them and placed, though, in an office in the chambers, or away from the public eye, in the Court of Criminal Appeal. It hung in a clerk's office there for another 10 years. Kept there because the Lord Chancellor at the time was of the view that if it were exposed to public attention, that it might enrage some people who were, disaffected and likely to cause political trouble in Britain. In 1951, some members of the King's Inns in Ireland, the Irish Legal Service, aware of the painting, made an approach to the government art collection in Britain and asked if the painting could be given to Ireland instead. And while they couldn't give it away completely, they gave it on long-term loan to the King's Inns in Henrietta Street in Dublin, with a note buried among all of the papers that accompanied it to say that if they forgot to ask for it back, it wouldn't be a disaster. So again, if you were somebody like Lavery, you might be advised to think again before you embark on a painting like that, which was enormously expensive to make, in the sense that it took a great deal of time, an awful lot of independent individual portraits and sittings in order to create an accurate representation of all of the people in it, and maybe that just wasn't worth it, given that the painting then, throughout Lavery's lifetime, was suppressed and never saw the light of day. And what of Roger Casement? Well, Casement, therefore, didn't get much of a representation in visual arts in Ireland either. In 1966, the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, the Irish petitioned the British government to allow them to exhume the body of Roger Casement from Pentonville prison and to bring it back and to lay him to rest in Ireland, where all of the other 1916 leaders were buried. The government agreed, and there was a formal reinterment of Roger Casement in Ireland in that year. And at the same time, the government decided to commission from one of the leading sculptors of the day, Oisin Kelly, to commission a statue of Roger Casement to be placed in Glasnevin Cemetery. Well, Kelly made the statue. It took him 2 years or 3 years to complete it, but sadly, by the time the statue was ready to be installed in Glasnevin Cemetery, the civil rights campaign in Northern Ireland, joined by the IRA, had in fact begun what came to be known as the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And in that state of renewed political unrest in Northern Ireland, the Irish government itself took fright and decided that it wasn't appropriate to install the Casement statue in Dublin, where it would be seen by a great many people and would again maybe attract the wrong kind of attention. So instead, they had the statue installed on Bannistrand in County Kerry, marking the spot where Casement was arrested in 1916, but far away from the kind of people who were likely to blow it up or cause a disturbance. But there were other ways of representing the struggle during the War of Independence, and even sympathy for it. Now, I apologise for the quality of this image, which is just taken from a book rather than a good image of the original painting. But here's a painting by Jack B. Yeats. It's called Singing the Dark Rosaline, Croke Park, 1921. In fact, the painting was painted on the anniversary of the Bloody Sunday shootings that took place at a hurling match in which Tipperary, in fact, was prominently represented in Croke Park in 1916, in November 1920. So a year later, at another match in Croke Park, Jack Yates spotted these musicians singing and playing My Dark Rosaleen, which of course is a song not about a woman, but about Ireland personified as a beautiful woman who must be protected, and calling on her menfolk to come and look after her. So the painting is a very subtle way of suggesting that sympathy for the Republican cause is still active, and we know this not only from the fact that the men are singing and playing it, but also that the people filing out from the crowd filing out on their way home from the match are paused for a moment and listen quietly to the performance of the song. It's one of many paintings done by Jack B. Yates that show his sympathy for this particular period in Irish life. But I want to get back to Sean Keating again. By 1924, Keating had painted this picture called An Allegory, which is in the National Gallery of Ireland, and it is an allegorical representation of Ireland as he found it 2 years into the establishment of the Free State. And what do we see? We see a family sitting in the closest to us, a mother and her baby, not looking terribly happy, and with the father of the family slumped in total dejection on the ground beside her. Now, the father figure is modelled on Keating himself. It's a self-portrait. And he's flanked on his right by two figures, one representing the IRA and one in the uniform of the Free State Army. And what are they doing? They are together burying the corpse of Ireland, epitomised by the tricolour flag over the coffin. They're burying the ideologies that led them both to fight for an independent Ireland because they're not happy with the outcomes. In the background, the building, the now derelict or partially derelict building represents the attacks on the old ascendancy class, which had ruled, of course, up to the introduction of the Free State, and which are now history and seen here to be history struggling to survive, and probably taking with them some negative but also a great many positive things. And on the left-hand side, beside the little family in the foreground, we see two other figures. They're the real winners of the Free State struggle, or the struggle to establish a Free State. And they are, of course, a clergyman, very well dressed with his nice shiny top hat on the left, and a politician with his gloves and his cane and his very well fed look. They are the ones who stand to prosper and to hold power in the new order of things, and Keating was not happy with that. Okay, here is another painting by Sean Keating, this one 2 years earlier. It's called Men of the South, and it's one of a number of paintings that he did of flying columns involved in the struggle from 1916 onwards. This particular one is Men of the South, who are particularly active, and of course Keating asked some of the people who were members of that flying column to pose for this portrait. So it's a very authentic documentation of the lives and the activities of the people in a flying column, and you can see there's a real sense of tension here because they're all keeping an anxious eye out, and one in the foreground has his revolver cocked in his hand, waiting for some action that they are about to intercept or to ambush. Keating's very well known for paintings like this, but there aren't many, and Keating was one, with Jack Yates, one of a handful of people who represented subjects from that period. Another one, though, and this is an important one, is this group portrait of the IRA General Headquarters staff, painted by another very well known and very highly regarded member of the RHA, Leo Whelan. And I'm showing it not so much because I think it's a great portrait, it's unfinished anyway, so it's not fair to comment too much on the quality of it, but because of the circumstances in which it came about and its subsequent history. The morning after the truce was declared between Britain and Ireland, Richard Mulcahy, who was the Assistant Chief of Staff, he was the assistant to Michael Collins in the headquarters staff, he and his wife Min Ryan, who also came from a family of very involved Republicans, decided that they could come out in the open now and enjoy, they could be seen safely, whereas they had been operating in semi-retirement or semi-hiding, pursuing a guerrilla war up to then. So they're now out in the open. They went into the city centre and had coffee, I think in the Gresham Hotel on the morning after the treaty was declared, and on their way they met the artist Leo Whelan, whom they already knew. And Min Ryan suggested to Leo Whelan that he should paint the headquarters staff. Her husband agreed, and they managed somehow to get portraits of all of the GHQ group that you see pictured here. But it took a long time to do this, and of course the treaty was followed very quickly by civil war in Ireland, and in that civil war, of course, some of the main participants in the painting here, including Michael Collins on the left, lost their lives. And so it wasn't the right time to try to persuade people in authority to take this portrait and pay for it. Instead, it languished in Leo Whelan's studio in Eccles Street for 30 years, during which time he finished it off a bit but never completed it because he had no home for it to go to. In 1946, he offered it to Eamon de Valera, offered to sell it to the Free State as an important painting of this history. But de Valera, perhaps not surprisingly, refused it, since his family and himself had very prominently fought against Michael Collins in the Civil War. And it really is the story of a divided Ireland. Sometime later, Leo Whelan died, and in the 1960s, the Mulcahy family decided that they should buy the painting. They bought it and donated it to the National Museum of Ireland, where it is now. But again, the message coming through from Kathleen Fox, from the Lavery painting, and from this one, is that painting this kind of subject matter was controversial and might not earn the artist any money. It might, in fact, set them back considerably to even engage with it. Okay, so we're still at 1924, and I'm showing you now a cover from the Dublin Opinion magazine, which really sums up the state of the nation in relation to the visual arts at this time. So it purports to advertise a national sculpture exhibition, and it has two exhibits. On the left, Ireland, represented by a young woman with a harp, the Mother Ireland, Roisin Dubh, My Dark Rosaleen image that we are familiar with from the 19th century. But the tag attached to her claims that Ireland is an unfinished study, and the person who is carrying out the study is W. Cosgrave, who of course was the Taoiseach in 1924 when this work was sketched by the Dublin Opinion, and she's standing on one leg. She's missing an important bit of herself. Well, we know where the missing leg is because it is the object on display on the other pedestal, only this time it appears to represent Northern Ireland and has a placard propped up against it saying, "Please do not touch." And that is, of course, because it's the property of the Unionists in Northern Ireland, whose leader, James Craig, is named on the placard. So it wasn't a great place for the arts in 1924. The Free State had no money to pay to commission artists to do anything. They had much more pressing priorities in their view in the first decade or so of the Free State. But they were anxious to create some kind of a visual identity for the country. And so what we see here is the penny postage stamp, which was part of a series of stamp designs brought out during the 1920s, so that every time they were sent out around the world, they proclaimed Irish independence. So you've got, what's interesting about this is that you have got an image of the country with no dividing line, no partition. Ireland, north and south, are one united country in this image, and the country itself is framed within a Romanesque arch that reminds us of the old early Christian heritage of Ireland, where Ireland was known as the island of saints and scholars and had a very distinguished place within European culture and indeed within the known art world of that time. However, I'm afraid we're not going to see much more of that in the Ireland of the Free State. Maybe this represents the beginning of some kind of change. In 1935, Eamon de Valera, who had now become the Taoiseach and ushered in a regime of Fianna Fáil government which lasted until 1948, de Valera decided that they should honour the 1916 Rising for its anniversary in 1936, its 20th anniversary. And so he let it be known that he would be happy to pay for a piece of artwork that would serve as an appropriate symbol of this. And it was brought to his attention that the sculptor Oliver Shepherd had made a statue of the death of Cuchulainn back in 1911 or 12. In other words, before the 1916 Rising, before the War of Independence, before the Civil War, and therefore not at all a new commission to represent that struggle. Yet this was the work that de Valera chose, bought it and had it installed in the GPO in Dublin in 1935. And of course there were other things as well, other representations of heroic struggle, if not immediately the War of Independence struggle, being made by Irish, or in this case Irish-American artists at that time. This is a man called Jerome Connor, an Irish-American artist working in America. He produced this portrait in bronze of Robert Emmet, which was installed in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco in 1919. Indeed, the launch was addressed by de Valera himself when he was on his tour of the United States to fundraise for the War of Independence. Now, there were 4 versions in all of this particular piece of sculpture. One is in Washington, one is here, one is, I forget where a third one is, and the 4th one was offered to the Irish government to mark the establishment of the Free State in 1922. Well, it was offered. They didn't have to pay for it. It was to be a gift from the Friends of Ireland in America in 1922. But the Irish Free State was in such a state of crisis, trying to establish itself and deal with the aftermath of civil war, that it didn't feel in a position to accept it. And it was offered again a number of times, and in every instance rejected, until finally in 1966, for the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, Tip O'Neill, the Irish-American Speaker of the House, the Houses of Congress in the United States, again rallied Irish America to the cause, and this time they gave the 4th version of Robert Emmet by Jerome Connor to Ireland and paid to ship it over. So we got it, and it's now in Stephen's Green in Dublin. So I'm suggesting then, just to pull things together a little bit, that the neglect of the visual arts in Ireland was influenced by a number of factors. Now, I won't have time to go into them all, but some of them include the following: a lack of infrastructure for the visual arts in Ireland following colonisation. And by that I mean there was really no history of Irish people with the money to commission and buy visual art and so on, and to support it at government level. The focus of successive governments had to be on economic development at the expense of the humanities, or indeed science and other things. The Catholic Church had a role to play in this, as we'll see. The Irish were generally, and the Irish government were generally, suspicious of foreign culture during the first couple of decades of the Free State, and that's partly because they were worried about the influence of communism and fascism in Europe, among other things. Godlessness in Europe. There was an educational focus in the schools on the Irish language and on reading, writing and arithmetic at the expense of the science and the humanities. And that had quite a big role to play. And then finally there was a prejudice against modernising artists who were at the time largely women, Protestant, Anglo-Irish, and were generally educated abroad. So all of those factors made it difficult for Irish art at this period. I'm showing you now just to tease out a little bit of what I refer to as the attitude of the Catholic Church there. Here's a little clip from an editorial in the boys' comic, The Our Boys, which was very popular in Ireland from the 1920s through to the late 1950s, maybe even as far as 1960. It's from the then editor in 1928, Brother Craven. He says, "Preachers may preach, teachers may instruct, parents may advise, but cinema pictures are more than a match for them all. Pictures leave an impression which can never be forgotten. They're a more powerful source of inspiration than all of the other sources combined. The dances, the dresses, the pictures showing bathers in scanty costumes. Added to the picture house scenes are quite sufficient to degrade, to demoralise, and to bring spiritual ruin on the holy families of our island." So pictures, in this case he's referring particularly to motion pictures, but images in general were regarded as unsafe. And in fact that led to all kinds of strange censorship of images, particularly film images, but also advertisements in the Free State, so that the Irish Statesman newspaper ridiculed, and I'm quoting, "the attempt in Dundalk and Cork to prevent the poster of a nude baby reaching for soap being used as an advertisement, and the solemn way in which the bill posters went to paint breaches on the baby, though in every household in the country the washing of nude babies is a daily occurrence." And to just expand a little bit on what I had to say about education, here's a letter, an excerpt from a letter written by Eamon de Valera in 1946, addressed to the National School Teachers of Ireland. He says, "I'm for cutting off every frill possible to us to make certain that the essentials are properly done. What I'm afraid of is that teachers are thinking all of the time of making subjects interesting and attractive, and that if they spend all of their time at that sort of thing, the mechanical routine which is necessary to go through a subject as a whole cannot be carried out." So in other words, teaching should be a mechanical routine to carry out the important things, and that it would be wrong of teachers to waste time trying to make their subjects interesting and attractive. Don't do it. Well, thank goodness Ireland did actually mature a little bit out of that position by 1970, but not until 1970. A new education curriculum was put in place for national schools, and gradually, and indeed secondary schools at that time also went through quite a significant change, and things began to look up. So by the time of the Celtic Tiger and the boom with money to spend on the arts in the 1990s through to the crash in about 2008, a great deal of work was made, and some of it very expensive work in materials like bronze, public monuments around the country. Here is a statue by John Coll of Countess Markievicz, made for the little village of Rathcormac in County Sligo in 2003. An expensive piece of work, given that it is made of cast bronze, not just one figure but 4 figures, and surrounded by this steel little safety surround, but also part of the artwork. So that would have been a very expensive piece of work, but one of many that began to appear during the Celtic Tiger. And I want to really more or less wrap up this talk by looking at just one of the 2016 commemorative exhibitions that happened a centenary after the Rising. This one was to commemorate the work of a woman called Kathleen Lynn, Dr. Kathleen Lynn, and I'm using this because I curated this exhibition myself and therefore was really involved in the thinking behind every single artwork. All of the works in this show were commissioned specifically for this exhibition, and all of them refer to different aspects of the life of Kathleen Lynn. So who was she? Well, Kathleen Lynn, whose portrait you see there, created out of literally hundreds of photographs of other Irish women by the artist Mary Kelly. It's called Matrylene, and it's now in the collection of Mayo County Council. Kathleen Lynn was born in County Mayo. She was a medical doctor. She qualified with all kinds of distinctions as a medical student and was offered a number of jobs when she qualified on condition that she worked as a volunteer, because it wasn't appropriate to pay women for work outside the home at the level she was proposing to work at. But anyway, she resisted that and did manage to secure work in hospitals, where she was appalled at the conditions that she saw the working poor of Dublin living in. Dublin was then one of the worst slums in Europe, and she set about with her great friend and partner, Madeleine French Taylor. She set about to do something about that. She took part as a supporter of James Connolly's in the 1913 lockout. She organised soup kitchens and helped to feed the worst affected families, and then by 1919 she and Madeleine French Taylor had set up the first mother and baby home in Dublin, specifically catering for the needs of newborn infants and their mothers. So she was a real activist in terms of the medical profession, working on behalf of the poor and children in particular. She was heavily involved in rolling out TB vaccinations in Dublin, because that was a problem that particularly affected the poor. She was also very concerned about the effect of soldiers returning from World War I and bringing all kinds of sexually transmittable diseases with them back to Dublin, where they infected a good many of the women, their families, in inner city Dublin. And all of these were problems for her and that she set about very actively to resolve. But she was also a member of the Irish Citizen Army. She took part in the 1916 Rising. She took over as the leader in Dublin City Hall when her commander was shot dead on the first day of the Rising. She was arrested, imprisoned, got out of jail, went back to her medical practice, continued to campaign for health reform, and indeed, for a brief period, was elected to the Dáil as a Republican candidate. But that's not all. She was also an active feminist, campaigned for the rights of women. She was a lesbian, although nobody talked about lesbians in 1916 or 1920, but she and her partner, Madeleine French Taylor, lived together very happily and openly and productively in Dublin. And she spent the 1920s and the early 30s lobbying hard for the first children's hospital, the first national children's hospital in Dublin. She got Michael Scott, the architect, to draw plans for it. She travelled around America looking for donations to help to set it up. She begged and borrowed from people in Ireland who could also help that effort. But when the hospital was actually opened in the 1930s, she ran up against one big piece of opposition, which came from her former friend and colleague, Eamon de Valera, in Republican circles in during the War of Independence. De Valera, in cahoots now with the Archbishop of Dublin, John Charles McQuaid, decided that it would be absolutely inappropriate to let Kathleen Lynn run a children's hospital because she was, wait for it, Protestant, and therefore might do untold damage to the infant children of Ireland. So she didn't get the job. She lived on for another couple of years, being involved in other things, all of them with an interest in health. So for instance, she was an active founder and participant in the Onoiga movement to get people out exercising in the fresh air all over Ireland, and so on. I won't give you any more detail. Suffice it to say that when she died, De Valera felt that it was appropriate to attend her funeral, and so he went to the funeral, but of course couldn't go inside the church because it would have been wrong of him as a Catholic to go into a Protestant church, so he stayed outside in the state car while her funeral ceremony took place without him. Okay, well, Kathleen Lynn really was forgotten about by everybody except her most devoted followers until the 100th anniversary of the 1916 Rising. But the Mayo Collaborative decided that they would celebrate her rather than some of the other Republicans in County Mayo, and as I said, got their resources together and commissioned an exhibition. Here is the work of one of the artists who took part in that exhibition. This is Geraldine O'Reilly. She went and looked at Kathleen Lynn's family home, her birthplace, which was in such a derelict state that although a number of us visited together, we weren't allowed to go inside because it was too dangerous. It's now being stabilised, but that's largely thanks to the work of commemoration through this exhibition and through artists like Geraldine O'Reilly. Beautiful drawing. Another of the artists who took part in that exhibition focused on what it would be like to be a revolutionary gun-carrying woman if it were to happen all over again now. And so thinking of what Kathleen Lynn had done in 1916 in a contemporary context, he in fact attempted to bring some Kurdish women from the Kurdish Liberation Army to Ireland to talk about their cause. That didn't actually happen, but he did instead ask women in a number of places around Ireland to make woven headgear for the Kurdish women, because they keep their heads covered all the time. Just go back for a moment to show you, to make headgear like this, but to have them woven in Ireland by people from Gaeltacht areas who, like I'm showing you an image of Peg Sayers from the Blasket Islands here in her traditional Irish shawl, really emphasising what Irish women and those Kurdish women have in common. But in the shawls that the artist Seamus Nolan got woven, they carried the Cumann na mBan from 1916 little logo and their badge on the corner of the shawl. Another artist who decided to look at Kathleen Lynn's feminism and activism is the artist Michelle Brown. Michelle Brown made an installation in which she created an environment with this lovely oak table that you sit at, and overhead are beautifully designed amplifiers with recorded conversations that Michelle Brown recorded between herself and something like 20 Irish women who were active in political and public life in Ireland. They range from Mary Robinson to Ivana Bacik, and their conversations were all about how to be a woman in Ireland who had interests that were not completely devoted to the home, but allowed women to have a life beyond the home. But they had these conversations, and you can listen to them at a table which itself had carved into it Article 41.2 of the Constitution, which drew attention to the state's recognition of the work that women contribute to the state by their role in the home, nothing else. So it's a protest against that. Another artist, Deirdre O'Mahony, created a series of posters, all of them relating to the place of women in Irish society and to health care. So I'm just showing you two of her posters. Here's one of them. After the most appalling litany of state-condoned violence on vulnerable women, is it time for a change? She asks. What would Kathleen say? Well, we know what Kathleen would say because she said it. Or another poster carries this text. Enda Kenny says we're the best little country to live in. Well, we're the worst little country to get acutely ill in. What would Kathleen say? Again, we know what Kathleen said in her lifetime. And I want to finish with this image, which is a 2010 recreation of the traditional equestrian monument. This is the equestrian monument throughout the history of art from ancient Rome to the 20th century has always been a monument to a great soldier and a political leader, usually a soldier who is also a political leader. Politicians who are not soldiers don't get this kind of a rollout usually. But the victorious soldiers are seen usually on their horses on top of a plinth, conquering everything around them, wearing their uniform, brandishing their swords, and you know, the picture of authority and conquest. There were a number of equestrian monuments in Ireland, all of them monuments to either kings of England or to leading soldiers in the British Army who happened to live in Ireland. In 1957, one of those monuments, the monument to Lord Gough in the Phoenix Park, was blown up by the IRA and seriously damaged. Now, Lord Gough's descendants took the pieces and put the work back together in the north of England. But John Byrne, an Irish artist, invited to make a monument to celebrate the future of Ballymun in Dublin for the Ballymun rejuvenation in I suppose you could say the first 2 decades of the 21st century. John Byrne chose to take the equestrian monument tradition and stand it on its head. The children of Ballymun, the teenagers of Ballymun, have long had a real association with horses. Travellers' horses, horses, if you think of the film Into the West, where one of them keeps a horse in a high-rise block of flats in Ballymun, you will understand what I'm talking about. In this case, he took the figure of the horse here, modelled directly from the Lord Gough monument, the recreated or restored Lord Gough monument in England. But instead of crowning it, if you like, with a great military leader, he sits a young girl from Ballymun on the back of the horse. She's wearing jeans and a hoodie and trainers on her feet, and has none of that swagger or bravado about her. She's just one of the kids of Ballymun, claiming her rightful place among her own community. Interestingly, as a gesture to, again, reinforce the sense of ownership by the community rather than that feeling of being conquered, by the military leader in this statue. John Byrne went into all the schools in Ballymun and asked the children to suggest a name for this monument, and the name they gave it was Mishnach, which means courage. So that doesn't relate to the War of Independence, although indirectly it does relate to the erosion of colonial conquest, which is of course what the Irish struggle for independence was directed against. And so I think it's appropriate to finish this talk by concluding with that image. Thank you.